Hello, and welcome to Australia in Focus, the podcast where Australian and international doers, thinkers, and changemakers dive into the issues shaping Australia. I'm Danni Hunter, founder and principal of Hunter Collective, and your host of Australia in Focus. In each episode, we'll explore the complex challenges, innovative solutions, and transformative ideas driving our nation forward. By diving deep into the here and now and looking ahead at what's possible, Australia in Focus is bringing you the conversations that matter, the conversations that illuminate the path to Australia's future. Well, it's a warm welcome to all of you to the very first episode of Australia in Focus. I'm Danni Hunter, your host, and today I'm delighted to welcome Bernard Saltz. Welcome, Bernard. Welcome to Australia in Focus.
Hi, Danni. Very pleased to be here and very honoured to be the first interviewer. I think I am, yes.
I couldn't think of anyone else because you are a scene setter. You are one of Australia's preeminent social commentators, demographers and futurists. You're also a published author, a renowned speaker and a very regular columnist with The Australian. So you've really spent your career, Bernard, sharing with Australians your views on what shapes our nation. And that's what we're here to discuss today, Australia's identity now and into the future.
Well, a wonderful topic. And certainly you're right. I mean, it's something that I have had a slight obsession with for the entirety of my career. Even in my university days, I was interested in Australian society, how we evolved and where we're going. And really, I've turned my interest into my career throughout my career. So, yes, I get up every morning and I think all things Australian in many respects.
Well, you're a lucky man because if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. So you're a very, very lucky man.
Well, look, I think that is true. And I think that's, it's a good lesson for anyone starting out in their career. I accepted in my 20s that, my interest in demography and in Australia and whatever may not lead to great prosperity. But in actual fact, by pursuing your passion, it actually shows through. I do a lot of speaking, as you know. I'll often get people coming up to me after the event and say, "Oh, Bernard, you're really, really passionate about what you're saying." And so, am I really? It comes through, and ultimately, it helps in communication if you clearly believe what you're saying.
That's right. And the energy you bring to these topics, like, how do you describe Australia's identity? I mean, that's a question we're going to talk to today, but you've also brought this amazing means of communicating with everyone. I think of the goat's cheese curtain and the comments about smashed avocado that took us all from thinking about, can we afford a house or can we afford breakfast? These are ways in which you've brought issues relevant to Australians alive for everyday Australians.
Well, I do think, you have to be engaged with the material. And, if I find it amusing or interesting or unusual, then I just put it out there. And, that approach seems to have worked. And, it's the basis to communication. Don't overthink it. Just be natural, warm, say what you think, have some evidence behind it. It certainly helps, and put it out there.
Well, good on you. I would request that we get a breakfast metaphor in somewhere today. So I'm not sure if it's the muesli mix of Australia or what it is, but I'm sure you can come up with something on the spot. Let's get into the conversation about Australia's identity, and I'm keen to hear from you as to how you would describe it with all of the knowledge and data that you work with. But also, what's unique about Australia from a global perspective in terms of our identity?
Well, this is a very, very interesting question about the Australian identity because I think it has changed. It has changed quite dramatically from the Australia of my youth. I can remember quite vividly much of the 1960s, and I think that Australia's identity changed during the 1970s. Of course, there was a cultural revolution, with the whole hippie movement, in fact, in the early 70s, late 60s or so. But for 150 years or whatever it is, Australia was very much a British outpost. And in fact, when I think about, and I often write about in The Australian, my upbringing as a kid in country Victoria, we could have been living in the East End of London when I think back of my childhood. What we ate, how we spoke, the language we used was all very British. And, 150 years after European settlement, it was still there, had not changed that much. Australian
Meat
identity,
and
I
free
don't
veg.
think. Well, yeah, and it changed quite dramatically in the 1970s. And 90s, we came more Mediterranean, with the Greeks, the Italians, were out with black tea, in with coffee and lasagna and whatever.
Thank gosh for
And
that.
well, yes, and we also embraced other ethnicities as well. I do think that over the last decade or so, we have pushed closer to America. And, we've always had that, probably since the Second World War, but it seems to have amped up, certainly with AUKUS. Just culturally, the fact that when we watch the TV news at night, we will hear the results of American basketball or the Super Bowl, or celebrate Black Friday or Valentine's Day. Now we are
Halloween,
very
crazy here.
Halloween is another one, and even
Yeah.
the language we use. I will know we've gone full American when mum turns into mom. It's a question of whether mum is going to remain by the 2030s.
It's very generational, isn't it? Like I know my kids, the content that they watch online and in media is very, very swung towards American culture, and the phrases they come up with, and the fact that they, the words that they use aren't like candy instead of lollies. That's something that we got in Halloween. So it's interesting how, as the generations come through, that shift will be really quite marked towards America, because it's what we watch and what we see.
Well, that is true, and in fact, even my own name, Bernard, which is the Irish pronunciation of Bernard, my daughter's friends, 15 years ago, would introduce themselves. They would talk to me as Bernard, as opposed to
yes.
Bernard, and as the American. And I think that Jared or Gerard has probably gone through the same Americanization of their name. So our language, our culture, our interests have shifted from where we were half a century ago. And the question is, well, where does this end? How far do we go? What does Australia look like in the 2040s? Would we recognise what Australia looks like in the 2040s? Would we be able to converse with Australians in the 2040s based on who we are today? And again, I think we're very, very plastic, pliable, malleable, changeable. We will cherry pick cultures, bits and pieces. And we saw that with the Greeks, the Italians, like, welcome to Australia, mate, what have you got to eat? And even the way we organised our homes. We pulled off the back part of our homes and opened it up to a kitchen family room with an al fresco space. Even the term al fresco from the Italian. So we're very aspirational, very global, very outward looking, I think, and also very well to do. We're a rich nation, in fact, when you compare ourselves with.
And do you think the question of American influence on Australia is unique to Australia? I'm sort of thinking of our context within the Asia Pacific region, or whether that's just America's influence globally.
Well, I think America has a greater influence in some nations, more so than others. In New Zealand, occasionally, certainly every year or so. I always get the feeling that it is far more British than Australia. So they're stronger linkages to Britain than I think than we have, and certainly in some Asian nations, there's been a stronger American influence. The Philippines, as an example, not just the war, but also with colonial linkages and so forth. So yes, America is it's preeminent power of our times, has been for the last not quite 100 years or so, and will be a major shaper of the world going forward. And I get the feeling that Australia is sort of being drawn along that pathway. So if you're looking at an Australian identity, Australian language, Australian accent, Australian preferences, and Australian cultural popular knowledge, very much shaped by America, with the occasional influence from Asian influences as well.
Yes.
Certainly in our diet, you would see that.
Yes. Yes. Now, I definitely don't want to go down the path of politics, but it certainly will be interesting, given the recent election in America, how those influences start to infiltrate our political dialogue here and the debates we have in Australia. I wanted to turn our minds now to the economic landscape. We've got relatively low employment here in Australia, but we're facing slower GDP growth and inflation that just sort of won't go away or won't get to the point where we need it to. And because of all that, our household spending is falling. We've got rising mortgage costs, and the essentials like housing, groceries, education, those kinds of things are becoming more expensive for Australians. So there's a really, I guess, complex social and economic context that's impacting Australia right now. How do you think that plays out in terms of the impact on our identity, but also on the things like living, working, playing, and what we do as Australians, and how our culture is formulated around that?
Well, I think it's really important the cost of living and how much it costs to buy a house and to rent and groceries and so forth. It goes to what I would call that sort of big picture equation of what living in Australia is like. And certainly, these are issues that also apply in other nations as well. Americans are concerned about inflation and the cost of living, and other nations as well. But you've got to look at a nation as a whole package. So, what are the prospects for a young person? And a young person to me is, say in their early 20s, starting out in their own household. What are the prospects of a young person being able to find a job, raise a family, buy a home or rent accommodation, and live a meaningful life, happy life? What are your prospects in Australia compared to other nations? I still think that even with our problems, that we're an incredibly fortunate nation, that prospects are still very good. And I think that is borne out in the sheer scale of immigrants who want to come here and students who want to study here. If that equation did not fundamentally work on a global comparison, then we would lose skilled immigrants to other nations like Canada or the US or wherever. But people are still wanting to come here in vast numbers. I think they can still see that, there is a way forward. There's a good quality of life. We're safe. We're secure. Good climate.
Relatively.
So I still think that that all things considered, in comparison with other nations, Australia offers prospect and opportunity that is very attractive to young people in a global sense.
So do you think, in a global sense, we really own that concept of being the lucky country?
Well, yes, I know it's. I know it was when it was first coined. It was used as an ironic sort of statement. We've kind of commandeered it. But I think that is correct. We're 27 million people. There's a number of ways you can measure this, but using IMF data, we are the 10th richest nation on earth in terms of GDP per capita in US dollars. 30 years ago, we didn't rank number 10, we ranked number 20. So we have ratcheted up the rankings over the course of a generation. I get it with cost of living at the moment, but just compare where we were compared to other nations 30 years ago. Australia has prospered over that time frame. And, you'd have to say, well, that's probably why many people see opportunity in Australia. Hopefully we can manage to continue to deliver that. Not just in the short term, but medium and long term as well. So when I look at just the cold hard data, I would say, well, yes, we still are the lucky country, and maybe we do need to work harder to keep it lucky going forward.
It's an interesting point you raised, because population growth and that debate around how much is too much is certainly being highly debated in Australia, and looking forward to 2025 and the federal government election, you would expect that to be quite a hot button issue. Where are we headed in terms of population growth? And do you think we are experiencing more than we can handle?
Well, it's certainly been problematic with the opening of the borders and with many students going home and visa holders going home and then coming back. So there was a period there, 2022 and 23, 2020 and 2 and 2023, and even into 2024, where there was a lot of catch up and resettling. But it still seems to have resettled at a far higher rate than we have experienced in the past. And by some measures, it's up to 500,000 net overseas migrants per year. In my long demographic career, I remember in the 1990s, the high assumption for overseas migration, net overseas migration by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in their 5-yearly forecasts was 180,000 people per year. And we're up at around 1 million or so or more. So it's completely out of all proportion to what we have experienced in the past. And the narrative is, well, that's kind of in response to the pandemic and it will settle down. Well, it's kind of taken a while to settle down, and I just think that it's sitting at a higher level. And of course, that then creates problems in the housing market and so forth. So I think we do need to get these things in proportion. I know it's difficult, but we do need to keep things. We need steady growth and strong growth, and we need to be generous, I think, as a nation, but we need to be sensible about this. I would say measured, considered, selected growth, moderate to high growth going forward, certainly not at the 500,000 mark and, closer to the 200, 250, something like that. It has got to be improvement on what we've had over the last 2 or 3 years.
And when you say sort of smart and considered growth, do you mean with a particular emphasis on, say, skills and productivity for Australia as a nation, making sure that people coming to Australia have skills that we need and are able to then contribute to the economy in a positive way?
I think that is really important. We should be far more selective in the kind of skills that we focus on in the future. And I know there's been a lot of emphasis on, say, professional skills, like medicos and so forth. But I also think we need vocational skills, trade skills, technical skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need people who actually can build stuff. Now, all of this is underpinned by what I call, and what demographers have called for about 25 years or so now, what is called the baby bust. The fertility rate has been declining for...
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Australia's birth rate just plummeting.
Well, yes, it's been on a continual slide for the last 50 or so years, and this is consistent with what has happened in other Western nations as well. We are still, generating more babies than people die, so we're still growing through natural increase. But it has created the problem in the 2020s onwards of the number of people coming into the workforce age group at, say, 15 through to 20. The number of people being born and then going into the workforce 15 or 20 years later is starting to be less than the number of people exiting the workforce. That's the baby boomers exiting at 65. It did not matter if there was a declining birth rate in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and 2000s, because the baby boomers were still in the workforce. They were 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. It matters when the baby boomers start to exit the workforce. You've got more people leaving than entering, and so you've got shallower labour pools. And you can either increase the birth rate and encourage, people to have more babies and so forth, or you can attract people from overseas. So these would be people with practical skills in construction, for example.
Yes, and you also have that mismatch, I guess, between government expenditure to support an ageing population and then the revenue generated from tax being collected from people in that workforce if you have a smaller workforce. Is that right?
Well, it is. This is an issue that every developed world nation will have. It's the first time in history where we're contemplating or will have vast numbers of people living beyond the working stage in the life cycle. If you go back to the 1950s, the average Australian lived to the age of about 68 or 69, 4 years after you got a pension, end of your life expectancy. Today, life expectancy is sitting around about 84. It's like 20 years beyond actual retirement. So we do need strong growth in the labour market to drive taxation, to deliver the skills, and maintain the quality of life that we have become used to. But it needs to be done in a measured, considered way. And the pandemic really threw things out of kilter because of the large flows of people out of the country and then back into the country. As I said earlier, we really need to get onto a steady level going forward that is more sustainable than it has been over the last, say, 2 years.
Besides those points that you raised, in what ways do you think the pandemic really changed the identity of Australia? Are there any kind of really key standout ways that you look to?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think the pandemic has been has mightily changed Australia, our behaviour. As an example, the whole work from home movement was not contemplated seriously prior to the pandemic. 5% of the workforce have always worked from home. No one but data nerds and census people kind of knew about it, 5%. When the last census was taken, it was 39% in Sydney and 29% in Melbourne. Now, I don't think that is going to go back to the long-term average of 5%. I think it'll go back to about 15%, which means there's about percentage points of the workforce who are long-term deciding to work from home in a hybrid arrangement. That's 1.5 million workers. And the reason why I think this is going to continue is because it delivers a better quality of life. Australians are very lifestyle focused. Do you want to commute an hour into the office and back out again 5 days a week for the next 30 years of your career? No. People in their 20s say, my father might have done that, my mother might have done that, but I ain't doing it. There's a better way to deliver workplace value. So the way we work, the use of digitisation, digital interactions. If you go to a discount department store, you'll do your own checkout, at the cash registers, whatever they're called.
Yes. I saw smart trolleys the other day,
smart trolleys
which were extremely interesting.
Or you could, you can go overseas. You can go to an airport in Australia. You can check your bags, go through passport control and immigration, and not actually interact with anyone. All of these changes, I think, have been hyped up by our greater use of technology during the pandemic. Who knew what a QR code was? Well, and a lot of people did, but vastly more had no idea of what a QR code was. Click and collect has come in. So there's a whole range of things, of behaviours that have changed as a consequence of the pandemic. It's accelerated our move into a digital transformation and ultimately then the use of AI as an example.
Do you think it's distanced ourselves from each other? Or do you think in some ways it has, in some ways it's brought us closer together, but in a digital realm?
I think the pandemic has had a negative, deleterious impact on the CBDs and that sort of inner city cafe lifestyle that Australians so enjoyed prior to the pandemic. I actually see more activity now in suburbia with, another 10% of the workforce working from home, orientating to their local community, perhaps more so than to orientate to the CBD of a capital city. So I think it's certainly changed.
See that on Mondays and Fridays. Mondays and Fridays in my local cafe are heaving. And then, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there's a lot more people on the trams and a lot more people on the roads going into the city.
Well, again, I think this is, a lot of people would see this as quite empowering, that you have greater control over how and when and where you deliver your workplace value. And I think they're the kind of values that appeal to Australians. I don't want to be told to go into the office. I don't want to have to sit there for 8 hours a day or whatever. I want to be able to work from home or even Zoom it in on vacation or from holiday. I use the word vacation. I am being Americanized. Don't even realize it.
You'll be trick or treating with my kids next year, I'm sure. Just staying on that theme. You advise Bernard, businesses and CEOs all across the country, which is a really, really important thing to do because I guess they're tussling with these issues every day and they've got their expectations of their people and their expectations of their stakeholders as to how an organization might function. You've got organizations, some that are saying, we want you in here 5 days a week, some that are saying you can work from anywhere, and most are in between. Within the context of Australia's identity, how do you advise organizations and CEOs? What do they need to think about and what do they need to do to make sure they've got the right talent, the best talent, but also are giving people, what they need and what they expect?
Well, certainly there are a number of occupations, number of jobs and tasks, a number of businesses that you need to be there. I'm sorry, you can't do that job from home. And so there's a lot of tightening that I think needs to happen. So CEOs and management teams, I think, are quite right to start to encourage people who really should do their job in a workplace situation to come back in. But there is another segment, another cohort, and I think it's quite substantial, of people who I think will rail against it, and particularly, say, older workers, maybe 35 and over. Once you've established your credibility, your relationships, you understand the organisation and your clients and whatever, you're much more confident about working independently and in a way that suits your lifestyle. So I think what I'm getting at is that I think there is a point at which pushing to get people back into the office just becomes annoying. People may not, reject it straight away. And the reason why I'm saying this is that everything I've read, everything I've done, every data set that I have looked at in my demographic career, and this goes back to my university days where I was looking at data for the colonies, in fact, in the 1880s. If there is one unifying feature of the Australian people, I think, it is the obsessive pursuit of lifestyle. We invented suburbia. We invented sea change and tree change. I think asking everyone to go back to the way we used to work and behave, I think, is a big ask for the Australian people. It was always odd, I think, asking a city the size of Melbourne, a city the size of Sydney or, southeast Queensland to come into the office 9 to 5 and then go back out again. And many will, but I think there is a proportion of the workforce that will say, I ain't doing that. And the additional number that I have is 10% of the workforce will be.
So it's undeniable that we are growing and Australia's identity is evolving as you've spoken to. But I guess within that, I'm keen to hear what you think are the essential ingredients for good growth, where we can, as you say, maintain that obsession with lifestyle that really is so unique to Australia. And there, Bernard, you have the muesli mix of good growth for Australia. It's been wonderful talking to you. There are so many insights that you have to offer. And I'm very, very excited to be able to launch Australia in Focus with this conversation. Any last words about Australia's identity, Bernard? Well, it's wonderful to talk with you about the lucky country in the lucky country on Australia in Focus. Bernard Salt, thank you so much for being with me today. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Australia in Focus with Bernard Salt. You can connect with Bernard on LinkedIn and at the Demographics Group. Remember to follow along with Australia in Focus on LinkedIn, Instagram, and on our website, australiainfocus.com. I'm your host, Danni Hunter, and I look forward to bringing you the next episode of Australia in Focus.